I want to talk to you today about material facts. But before we get into material facts, we should take a minute and review deficiencies. As you recall, there's two types of deficiencies that can appear in a property. There's latent defects and there's patent defects or deficiencies. And latent deficiencies are hidden. You can't readily observe them by going through the property. Patent defects are ones that are observable. And the rule of thumb was anything that's a latent defect has to be disclosed if it's known. So you as a real estate agent have to spend time talking to your seller and find out what is in the property that could be conceivably a latent defect, a foundation problem perhaps, something in the walls that you can't see, a problem with even with the soil. There used to be an oil tank and it's been dug up, but there could be contamination in the soil. Whatever could be a latent defect, find out, and that's got to be disclosed. If the seller doesn't tell you, lies to you about it, you can't disclose what you don't know. But you got to show that you've done a diligent search to try and find out about latent defects. Patent defects always came under caveat emptor. Buyer beware. In other words, up to the buyer to discover it. It's not up to the seller to tell it. I always was a big fan of using a seller property information statement where the seller would say everything. And I felt that a buyer should know what he's getting, the seller discloses what he's selling, and they come up with a fair price based on that. But in law, they say, no, the buyer's got a right to know latent, but the buyer, it's up to him to discover patent. And if he doesn't discover them, well, then the seller gets away with one. But the rules have changed a little bit under material fact. And this isn't something new under this new act that's being proposed. Material fact is outlined as it stands right now in the Code of Ethics of the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act. And the material fact basically, at least in my understanding of it, is anything that could affect a buyer's decision to buy or how much they pay. But if you look at the definition in the Act of material fact, it's a little bit stronger than that. Let me take a minute and read it to you. It says a broker or salesperson who has a client or a customer, I'll talk about that in a minute, in respect of the acquisition or disposition of a particular interest in real estate shall, at the earliest practicable opportunity, disclose to the client, customer, the material fact relating to the acquisition or disposition that are known or ought to be known by the broker or the salesperson. So they're saying whether you're representing the seller or whether representing the buyer, you've got an obligation to disclose material facts. They're saying whether you are representing a buyer as a client or whether the buyer is a customer, you've got an obligation to disclose material facts. I don't agree with that. I think RICO's skating on very, very thin ice here. They never really understood customer. Unfortunately, under the Trust and Real Estate Business Act that's coming, our Brokers Act is coming out now, they're doing away with customer. But they took the position that if a buyer signed a contract as a buyer representation, then they were a client, and if they didn't, they were a customer. And the common law of agency says if you are advising them or if they're relying, it's implied agency relationship, and it's very, very enforceable as agency. So you start talking to them about material facts to a customer, and you're going to make them a client pretty quick. So be careful of that, and be careful of that when they're self-represented under the new act. I kind of got sidetracked there a little bit, but under this material fact, they're saying you've got an obligation to discover them and disclose them. Okay, so as a listing agent, what you want to do is you want to ask about latent defects. Ask thoroughly, ask in general, tell them what a latent defect is, ask them if they know of any, and then start asking specifics. Then go on and inquire about patent defects, anything that you know about that needs to be addressed in the house, any problems we have in the house, talk to them about that. And then talk to them about material fact, explain what a material fact is, and say, is there anything you can think of in the house that would affect the buyer's decision to buy or how much they're going to pay, and find out about that. And be very, very diligent. And in fact, I would advise you to use a residential information checklist. That's Form 820 and Form 823. That's kind of the same as the seller property information statement, but you don't have to make it available to the public. You don't have to even notify it in the listing, but it gives you a yardstick to go by and make sure you've covered all these issues when you're discussing them with the seller. Now, Let's suppose you're a buyer and you're a buyer agent, you're representing the buyer. Well, one of the things is that material facts can be subjective. There's no absolute with material fact. One person, for example, maybe if a person died in the house at some point in the past, they would never consider buying that house because of their ethnic background or religion, whatever. Another person wouldn't think twice about it. Well, if you're selling a house that's 150 years old or in the country or in the core of the city, the chances are good that somebody passed away in that house at some time in the past because they didn't have hospice and people didn't go to the hospital to die. Often they died at home. You don't know that, but you got to find out whether that's an important thing in the mind of the buyer or what else is very important in the mind of the buyer. Have a long conversation with them to find out. Then go to the listing and take a good hard look at the listing to see what's itemized there that needs to jump out at you. And then I'm going to tell you that key factors, you shouldn't just take the statement on the listing, you should check them. And I would check zoning and I would check taxes. Those are two things that can be screwed up. And I wouldn't say, well, that's what the listing said. You're representing your buyer. You're looking after the buyer's best interest. Those things are material facts. And then I would also advise you to be very, very diligent about what you're looking at. I used to sell a lot of country properties, and I sold to Montrealers who were moving into the Ottawa Valley, and they were buying a country property. They never lived in the country before. And you show them a Victorian farmhouse, and they would fall in love with it, the big baseboards and the softwood upstairs and the hardwood on the main floor and so on. And they didn't notice that the upstairs bedrooms didn't have closets. A lot of times these old Victorian houses didn't have closets. You used wardrobes or armoires in the bedroom. Well, that's a material fact. They need to know that. Also, they need to know what the hydro amperage is. I listed some time ago a country property out on Morris Road in Niagara Falls, and it was Mr. Morris who was owning the property, was moving into a home. He was in his 90s. He was born in that house. And when I took the listing, way back when I took listings, I took the listing and it had 30 amp service. And I talked to them about that. They said, well, that's just fine. We know that if you plug in the toaster, you got to unplug this. And if you're going to have the pump come on, then you got to unplug something else. Well, not everybody's willing to live like that. When the hydro first came into the house, there weren't near as many appliances as there are today. That's something that a buyer needs to have pointed out to them because they may miss it. And then you'd sell a country property in 100 acres, and the farmhouse was right in the middle, and they talked about all the privacy and the wood behind and so on. And they forget about the fact that that great big long laneway with a dip in the middle of it, it's going to sock in with snow all winter. And if they got to get to Montreal to work or wherever it is, if you're selling in this area, they better be aware that that is a material fact. So you need to, as the real estate agent, draw their attention to that. And any issues that are important to the buyer. And let me say that that RICO is taking a harder and harder look at material facts. It's going to become more and more important under the new act. I've seen in RICO where they've gone after a listing agent. When he took the listing, he made incorrect warranties about the flooring. In one case, and I had this happen years ago, a great big country property, and in the great room, it had parquet flooring and a lovely carpet. Well, the owner took the carpet, and the parquet was just around the outside of the property of the floor, and inside was just plywood. And that would be a surprise to the buyer, and the real estate counsel would take the attitude that I should have pulled that carpet back and looked, or at least asked the seller about it. These are the kind of things that RICO's zeroing down on now. And when I saw where the hydro had to be updated and the seller had a quote about how much it cost, but it was an old quote. Turned out it would cost a lot more. The listing agent made that available to the buyer agent, and the buyer relied on it, and it was quite outdated and it cost them a lot more. RICO held the listing agent and the buying agent accountable. So you need to be very, very careful. So you want to make sure that you understand what material facts are. You've gone over with your buyer and found out what, in their mind, material facts are. You've gone over carefully on the property and determined anything from a squeaky floor to a problem with hydro to a long laneway that could be material facts, and you brought it to their attention. And then anything else, I should say one other thing. If the buyer mentions anything that's important to them, and it could be the taxes, it could be the hydro, it could be anything. It could be what's happening on the vacant lot across the street. As soon as they mention something, you've got an added obligation to go above and beyond to find out and make sure you find out, if it's at all possible, the information that they're looking for. Rico's going to be very, very carefully scrutinizing problems and complaints relative to material facts. If there's anything in question, make it a condition of the offer. I hope that makes sense. I want to thank you for investing your time. I'll talk to you again next week.